In the beginning, there was no bread whatsoever. But then, flour, salt, and water came together and condensed into a lifeless ball of dough. And eventually, tiny microscopic organisms so small that the human eye can't see eventually began to propagate in this lifeless dough. And eventually, it would eat the simple sugars and produce carbon dioxide, creating a swampy, gargling pool of liquid, liquid, solid, and gas. Eventually, as the dough would continue to expand, and all the carbon dioxide would condense, and eventually the CO2 would expand the dough so much that the very gluten structure would completely tear the fabric of the network of gluten would tear the gluten structure that is the fabric of the dough. But alas, for some reason that is unknown, the dough was put into an environment that was so hot that the yeast began to actively give its last burp of CO2, and the dough began to double in size in a phenomenon known as the oven spring. And then, as the temperature rises to 160 degrees, the yeast begins to die, and the temperature rises to 194 degrees. And the first, the sugars begin to caramelize in the crust of the dough, becoming a really crispy, crusty, flavorful 1 millimeter crust that we know as bread. And eventually, the temperature begins to drastically cool, and it's brought to room temperature. And because of these chemical reactions and hungry humans and yeast farts, we now know how our bread was created. So today I want to talk about how, this is my big bread theory. I want to talk about how bread, being a baker, explain to you the process. Today you're going to learn how bread is made and how that kind of applies to your life. So when you make bread, it begins with the starter. The starter, the levain, the poulish, it has many of these names. The mother, it's a natural mix of just water and flour. It's really interesting that because I'm not particularly religious or spiritual, but you might be, and it all starts with the starter. It brings the life. It is the spirit, the soul that goes into the center of bread. Without the starter, there is no bread. It's just a cracker. Then, the next step after you make your starter, which is just equal parts flour and water left at room temperature around 80 to 85 degrees, you'll get your natural yeast, and that will become the foundation of your sourdough. Then, the next process of the bread baking process is mixing. Don't you find it kind of interesting that bread is only 3 ingredients: salt, water, and flour? Just kind of like us as humans, fundamentally, we're made up of the same things, but we're all vastly different. If I were to make baguettes, sourdough, multigrain, all of that, it would be made with the same ingredients: flour, water, and salt. But because of certain other factors of ratios of water, the temperature, the environment that it's grown up in, you have totally different kinds of bread. Next, that's important in the mixing is a process called autolyse. This is very crucial to making really good bread. So when you mix bread, you actually don't want to introduce the yeast right at the beginning. You want to wait. You just want to combine the water and the flour. And the longer you let the water and the flour sit together, the more complex the dough is going to become. It allows better absorption for the gluten, and it creates more releasing of sugar, so that dark, deep crust that you like out of a nice piece of bread, that is because of the autolyse. You can autolyse for 30 minutes and get a good result, or you could autolyse for even up to 16 hours before you introduce the starter, and you'll have a more complex dough. Kind of see this, view autolyse as kind of like preparation or practice in your life. Who here plays an instrument?
I used to play the clarinet.
Okay, when you played the clarinet, when you had to perform in front of people, what did you need to do? Practice. And if you didn't do that, what would happen?
I was terrible.
Exactly. View that as the autolyse. You want to have that patience to prepare yourself. Next in the mixing is the final mix, which is where you introduce the starter or the soul. So now you've practiced your piece. Now that you've got the technical side down, you want to introduce the life, your own personality into it, the soul of it. So you introduce the starter and the salt, and now you can let the next step, which is the bulk fermentation or the proofing, where it's called proof because you're trying to prove that it's alive. If during the time, proofing is a great way to kind of feel, think of it as like the moment before you perform or while you practice, that confidence you get during your rehearsal. If you know that your dough is rising, you know that all your hard work and efforts is starting to achieve and you expect a good result. So let your dough proof. Next, you need to divide and shape the dough. After the dough has been fermented for a few hours, you want to pull the dough out. And for me, as in a commercial bakery, I divide the dough up into 1 kilo batches, try to be as consistent as possible, and then I shape it into any kind of thing. And the shape is crucial. I put it into a basket. Sometimes I want it to be round. I put it into a couche if I want it to be a baguette or an oblong-shaped basket. This is where I want to define what I want people to think the bread is, or just how I want the bread to look. It's very aesthetic. Then finally from here is the final fermentation. Let it relax in the basket. It starts to take the shape of the basket, and it allows you to, it allows the dough to get that extra complexity. So this is basically the calm before the storm. You can either let it rest overnight, or you can let it rest in a few hours if you're ready to bake. Then comes down to the scoring and baking. So before you throw the dough in the oven, you want to make sure your oven's really hot, and you take a little knife or a razor and you score. This is where you add your pattern. Think of this as sort of like covering up your flaws. Because the reason why you score is because of the CO2 buildup in bread, you score it to allow where the direction of the bread is going to bake. So if your dough is weak on one side and you don't slash it, it's going to pop a hole in the side. So this is your part. This is the part to really turn your weaknesses into a strength, to make your bread look beautiful and have that nice pattern. And then, of course, after the bake, the most important part is rest. So when the dough comes out, you get to see your final product. But just like in life, you could do everything right, and still the bread might not come out the way you wanted. You'd have no idea why. This is something that I face every day in the bakery, because there's so many things that go into bread baking, so many factors that could, even if the weather is different that day, the bread might be different. So, if the bread does come out the way you want to have the patience to let it cool down, because if you eat it too hot, you might burn yourself, or the crumb hasn't, completely settled. So, with bread baking in mind, think about it, how you can apply this to your life, and also to make delicious bread, because just like the bread that you bake, tomorrow doesn't have to be the bread that you baked yesterday. Just like in life, you have second chances. You have many applications to experiment and find your way till you find the loaf that is your life. Thank you.